From Brandeis University in semi-quarantine, welcome to Recall This Book, a podcast that looks backwards to see into the future. Our idea is to assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events by looking at books that shaped the world we inherited. Today, my co-host is John Platz. Hi, John.
Hello.
And Hayal Akarsu. Hi, Hayal.
Hello.
Hayal is a junior research fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and she holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Arizona. Her dissertation, to be turned into a book, is called Reforming the Police: Violence, Security, and the Social in Turkey. And it analyzes the entanglement of European Union-inspired police reforms with authoritarian governance in Turkey. She has some recent publications, and one of them, which just emerged, is called Citizen Forces: The Politics of Community Policing in Turkey, with American Ethnologist in 2020. Our episode today continues our mini-series on global policing, by which we don't mean either Interpol or the status of a hegemonic power such as the US that claims to act as the police force for the world. We mean the topic of policing and police power in global context. In keeping with our podcast strategy of juxtaposing examples from different times and places, we'll be discussing Hayal's work and also bringing in some examples from Brazil. So maybe to start us off, Hayal, can you tell us a bit about your work and about the field work that you did for it?
Sure. So I work on the implementation of police reforms in Turkey, and I can start actually by talking about how I started this project. I grew up in Turkey in 1990s, where at the backdrop of police violence and incredible police brutality against the political opposition and all kinds of marginalized identities. And in 2000s, I was struck by seeing all the smiling, caring images of police posters reflecting the police reforms that Turkey is undergoing. So I started the question, okay, what is that? Why do police in Turkey invest in building such a caring image and reform? And it was a period of EU harmonization projects where police has invested a lot on different kinds of reform projects. So but in 2013, when I have started in my preliminary research, Gezi Park protests happened. And the protest was mainly a sit-in against the demolition of City Park, but then turned into a large, massive scale anti-government protest because of the police brutality inflicted on protesters. And strikingly, when these protests were happening, police was actually implementing a project, EU-funded project on prevention of disproportionate use of violence. So I asked, okay, how can I make sense of this paradox? On one hand, police doing a project to prevent disproportionate use of force, but still we experience excessive violence of police on protesters. So I decided to work on what police reform do to the police and what police do with police reform if they are not preventing violence. So I did a field work for 18 months in the police academy, in the police stations. I looked at the, for instance, one cohort of police students. I took classes with them, sat in on classes with them. I also patrolled the streets with the police, attended their all kind of community policing activities. And I also observed these international networks of police reform. So because police reform, especially nowadays, is more than a global phenomena as we think, because they have all this kind of circulating materials of reform, and they have been implemented in different parts of the world.
Okay, so you touched on a lot of themes that we've been talking about for the last week, collectively have been talking about for the last few weeks. The relationship between the police and the rest of the government, police as a state-sanctioned form of violence, attempts at reform, and the question of whether those are effective and what they're effective for. How do you see your work as connecting to, say, the recent, social movement, particular iteration of Black Lives Matter and the criticisms of state police violence?
Actually, like one thing that relates to what broader historical moment that my research touches often is the question of reform, because we recently we hear a lot that reforms do not work, and indeed in my work I show that reforms do work, but not in the way that we aim them to be working. For instance, I can give one example about all of these trainings on the use of force, right? For instance, in 1990s, police in Turkey tend to understand the question of violence as something they need to hide, right? Like they are doing torture, but it's kind of something that you do in the backstage, something that you need to cover up.
You're not supposed to talk about it, but it does.
Yes, right. It was a kind of secret. But with these reforms of standardization use of force, I realized that most of my interlocutors came to understand their work more like as being a force experts. So all of these, for instance, standardizations about use of force continuum that gives you this kind of escalation of force, which needs to be proportional to the resistance you face. Then you see most of the police officers claiming that, okay, what I did was not a torture or violence. I just used my legally entitled right to use of force, and it was proportional to the resistance I faced. So this was, for instance, one of the things that we hear a lot in the United States too. Recently, I was looking at the statistics about assault rates against U.S. Like Borders and Customs Agency. When you see that, like they have this incredible higher rates of assault rates against officers, because this is in a way their way of showing that, okay, we didn't do anything wrong, but we were in threat, right? I felt the threat, so I
like a self-defense.
Yes. And for the Black Lives Matter in Turkey, racialized policing exists to a certain extent. But what we see in Turkey is mostly the kind of disproportionate distribution of police violence, especially against the marginalized communities. For instance, Kurdish people, or Alevi religious minority, or other kinds of like gender and sexual minorities. And I remember one slogan that was chanted during the Gezi protest, which was like kind of protests pointing to police and saying that this self-simit, which is a Turkish type of pepegel, police self-simit and live in dignity. They were asking police to kind of to question what they are for, which part of population are they supposed to protect. These kind of moments actually invite larger public to question the role of police in a society.
Actually, so I have a question that relates to that, Hayal. I love your recent articles. They're so fascinating about the role that the language of reform plays in implementation. And for example, you have the case of sort of community policing, where you talk about the way that community policing ends up being an enabling structure for the sort of violence against minority communities that you just referred to. So I guess the question I have, it's a really big one. It's how you think about the relationship between what the police do and are the police carrying out a governmental, like a governmental agenda that is supported, or so that what you see with the police is they are basically the instrument of carrying out what is a broadly supported policy anyway, versus understanding the police as like a machinery with a logic of their own. Because I sometimes feel in the United States that people are either confused or conflicted about whether they see the police, the problems with the police being the police doing what society as a whole wants them to do, or the police doing this thing which is just like inherent to the logic of policing, which is not really carrying out a governmental
That's
agenda.
actually, just to jump in, that's a really good point, because I think one of the conversations that's come out really clearly and is not resolved is, are the police not doing what they're supposed to do, and that's the problem, or is the problem that the police are doing what they're supposed to do? And that also runs through your work, but that's your question, right, John?
Yes.
I think it's an excellent question, and my short answer is actually police doing both kind of combining all these larger governmental ideas about reform or how the society should be divided or structured. But also police has its own logic. And in addition to that, I can add that police is also doing in a way what public asks for them to do. This is also something that we need to take into account. And we usually think that police is just a sole agent. But when we think about all kind of like demands of public and popular support for the police, we also see how these different scales of roles of policing are coming into play.
So you, when we were discussing this conversation, we decided to bring in a book that I want to shift to in a second, which is called City of Walls by Teresa Caldeira. It's about Sao Paulo in Brazil. But I think this is an interesting segue, because one of the things that Caldeira talks about is sort of talk of crime. So she kind of distinguishes between actual crimes that may or may not be recorded, but also a kind of, language or topic of conversation of, crime is getting worse, and a sort of generation of noise around that was connected to a need for, or perceived need for, more police or more private security. Did you see that in your case, that people were sort of maybe not talking about crimes as individual events, but talk of criminality, say?
Absolutely. Talk of crime is actually part of all of this community policing activities, or general reception of the public. Because so there are think about some social problems, about the economic crisis, about the urban transformation, and when do we start to think them through the lens of crime? So when do we start to think all of these different social political problems as a problem of crime? So this is one thing that I observed, and also what I like most about Caldeira's book, that there are several things, but about the talk of crime, she says how the talk of crime is contagious, right? How it spreads and how it proliferates, and how through the talk of crime and through the fear of crime, new techniques of exclusions are developed. So, and police in a way contributes to this increase in violence. Both they are part of the problem in some ways, in Caldeira's case, and in my case too. But also, she also talks about how through this talk of crime, they became more focused on these public offenses, they thought. And other things, and I haven't talked much about in my article, but what I liked about Caldeira's research, again, the link she makes about the private security and the public security, right? Because security has become a service both and sold in the market. And when the upper class in Brasilia, Sao Paulo, when they invested in private security firms, building walls and creating more segregated cities, then they started to think police for the less favored ones and private security for the rich, which I also observed in my research.
Yeah, this is kind of an unspoken part of this whole discussion, about, you know, private policing, which which may sort of, depending on the situation of inequality and polarization in the country, may rush to fill a gap that is left by other kinds of policing.
The University of Chicago has the second largest police force in the state of Illinois.
Right.
That's so interesting, actually. Like, as someone, like, I did my BA in Turkey, then I moved to United States in 2007 to start my MA in New York. And after having spent like more than a decade in the United States, still it strikes me that like universities in the United States, they have a police, right? So like seeing police on campus in Turkey, usually it means there is a coup or something like that.
Right.
So what, and I was even thinking, okay, so I'm locked down from my office, why I need to call the police to get my door unlocked, right?
Yeah.
All kind of different services that police do in the universities is actually like very interesting thing. And also it reminds us to think, like, when we talk about the police, actually we are talking about a huge like industry and huge like institution, like a state, which perform so many different roles, right?
Yep.
I think that's an excellent point, and just a couple of things about the bracket creep there. One is that Brandeis police were only recently armed. It wasn't even after 2001. It was as a result of some other incident. Maybe it was the marathon bombing or something, but there doesn't really seem to be any rational reason that they suddenly got armed, but they did. And that defines them in one way. And then the other way is that question of, right, I mean, getting locked out of your building is such a great example. Or if somebody has a psychological crisis, where do they go? And lately I've seen signs appear. Elizabeth, you might know more about this than I do, but like in DC, there are tons of signs where my parents live and my brother, there are tons of signs saying things that you can do rather than call the police. And it's basically just helping people to reimagine the division of governmentality, like, and I do think that's an enormously important question. Like in Massachusetts, there's a few sorts of criminal justice work that are performed by the department, like the pre-release centers in Massachusetts are operated by the Employment Bureau or the Labor Bureau rather than the Department of Corrections. So like these little internal divisions, which are so invisible to most of us outside the system, but probably very crucial.
Right. I mean, go on, Hayal. Go ahead.
Or we try to not to see it, right? Because one thing I can give credit to police, like Turkish police, they were constantly complaining that they were asked to do too much. And I also observed in the field kind of social policing projects that police do, visiting people's homes, asking for them to like what kind of needs they have, psychological or kind of do they need a job. So, and police were doing okay, like they treat us as social workers with guns, but we have other things to do. So why are we doing all this kind of other things?
Totally, but I feel like that also relates to that question of like whether they're doing what they ought to be doing or they're doing something that is distinct from what they're asked to do, because that social working function is, as I understand it, like part of the vision in the US of what community policing is, right? Like if the officer is present at the school talking to kids on the playground, or if the officer is like at the local convenience store, hearing from them about the problem of the broken street light, then the idea is that they'll be less likely to use deadly force in the neighborhood.
Right. But I mean, that's part of the argument around defunding the police, right? Is it's not so much about defunding as kind of dismantling this bundle of activity, right? In order to clarify and to redirect investment into these other things that wouldn't necessarily be handled by the person who also has a gun.
Right, but
and most of the time when the police handles that kind of situations, they're not doing anything. They are not doing much, right? What they are doing is, for instance, like if people complain about homeless people, they're just taking them from one location to another. So it is just like taking the problem out of the sight of the citizens who feel uncomfortable of that problem.
I agree with that, you guys, but can we just pause on I mean, I do think there's an innate
Sure.
tension here, because to the extent that one expects part of policing to be more like social worker functions, one creates a vocation that has that kindler, gentler side to it. And to the extent that one takes those roles away from the police, one does, you know, Starsky and Hutchify. You know what I mean? What?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying. I think it's sort of, it's a tension that's produced by the evacuation of support and funding for other kinds of services, right? I mean, if there was great provision of health services and employment services and other kinds of things in a neighborhood,
Yeah.
the police might still be rescuing kittens off of the roof and hanging around.
No, that's firefighters.
Firefighters, right?
Yeah. Kittens are firefighters.
See, it's all getting mushed up.
Yeah,
But
no, but I Elizabeth, I 100% hear what you're saying, but I guess I'm just saying, like, I do think some of this stuff is baked into the problem of the division of labor, like I feel like there's a Weber analysis here about professional specialization, you know, like.
right. I just think that would be less of a problem if there was actually any funding for any of those other things.
Yeah.
Relative to the amount of funding for the police. Actually, I think this is a good time to shift to our recallable books. So, Hayal, do you have something to bring to the table?
Sure. So there are many great ethnographies right now emerging on police in different parts of the world. So I think it's really important to read about policing and police in different parts of the world. But for today, I want to suggest a TV show. Probably you all know The Wire as a kind of recallable show, because what I like most about The Wire is it shows us that this complex space of policing. And for instance, we see how wiretaps and technology shifts, they shift the temporal rhythms and spatial labor of police work. So you see on the one hand this violent presence of police on the streets of Baltimore, but you also see how policing with technology increasingly has become the sedentary management of data, evidence, and code, all this kind of like backwork of the policing. So instead of all these heroic shows on police, I think The Wire has a kind of ethnographic quality in telling the kind of entangled relations that police are into, and the way how like these neighborhoods are policed heavily in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll bring the text that I wanted to bring in is actually Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and particularly the section at the end of the book, which documents some of the psychiatric cases that he and his colleagues encountered and worked with. And Fanon is really using these to talk about the psychological damage and deformation that colonialism causes, and on everybody, but in the examples that he gives about the police in particular, it's also the damage that is done to the colonizers. And in particular, he has a really harrowing case about a police, I think he's a captain actually, of a police officer who is engaged in pretty constant torture to the point of death of potential informants, and who has developed a series of severe psychiatric symptoms, and who's really come to seek medical advice in order to to be able to get back to work. So Fanon writes, his superiors refused to give him sick leave, and since moreover the patient, that's the police officer, did not wish to have a psychiatrist certificate, we tried to give him treatment, quote, while working full time. The weaknesses, that is torturing people. The weaknesses of such a procedure may easily be imagined. as he could not see his way to stopping torturing people, that made nonsense to him, for in that case he would have to resign. He asked me without beating about the bush to help him go on torturing Algerian patriots without any prickings of conscience, without any behavior problems, and with complete equanimity. So the relationship between the police and authoritarian state power, between the police and colonialism, the racialization of police work, and also, I guess, at a more general level, the way in which police and policing become a way to think about all of these other questions, these bigger questions of power and violence, race, and the state.
It's a great book.
Yeah. So I guess we have come to the moment when we'll have to thank you and say goodbye. So thank you so much, Hayal, for joining us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Thank you, Hayal. That was great.
Thank you.
Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. It is affiliated with Public Books and most of the time has been recorded and edited in the Media Lab of the Brandeis Library and sometimes in our homes by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues in the Boston area and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy, Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Caliska Ross. Mark DeLello oversees and advises on technological matters. We miss him sorely. We appreciate the support of University librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly at ferry or at plotz@brandeis.edu, or you can contact us via social media and our website. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or to rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You might be interested in checking out past episodes, including topics like vectors of warfare with Vincent Brown, or our first episode on policing and white power with Dan Kreider and David Cunningham, or money as a social and political project with Christine Desan. We also have our spring 2020 series called Books in Dark Times, where we converse with various partners about what books bring them comfort and joy in these cataclysmic moments.
And Elizabeth, can I also put in a plug? We hope to continue the Global Policing series most immediately with a discussion about Indigenous Australian deaths in custody. So look for that in the future.
Great, thanks. Thank you and goodbye until next time.